In this video, I'm going to teach you 38 different positional ideas and concepts that you need to know in the Caro-Kann defense. So first things first, what I want to say is that this video was inspired by Semasaka's 32 ideas in Caro-Kann, but there are some things that I wanted to expand upon and some details I wanted to explain differently in this video. So there are going to be some major differences between Sam's video and mine. However, because we're both talking about the same opening, of course, there's going to be major overlap as well. Definitely check out Semasaka since he has a lot of great content. I'm going to leave a link to his video in the pinned comment. With that being said, let's get started with the idea number one. So idea one in Caro-Kann is going to be to get the light square bishop out. So let me briefly go back to the beginning position. So whenever we teach beginners chess, we tell them that you need to challenge the center, and we can challenge the center in a couple of different ways. And one of the ways to challenge the center is with the d-pawn. This is called the Scandinavian defense. And sort of the downside of the Scandinavian defense is that after white captures, in some lines you have to take, no, not have to, but you take with the queen, and then you get kicked out and you lose a lot of tempi. So the idea of Caro-Kann and idea of French as well is that you want to support the d-pawn by one of your pawns. So after c6 and opponent plays d4, you go d5. If they capture you, you want to have the ability to take back with the pawn and maintain control over the center. However, unlike the French defense, our pawn here is on c6 and not on e6, which means that our bishop in Caro-Kann is going to be open. In French defense, it is locked in. However, in Caro-Kann, it is going to be open. Now, the downside of Caro-Kann compared to French, though, is that in a lot of positions, we have to play this move c5. For example, in a lot of these advanced Caro-Kann positions, we have to play c5. However, we already played c6, so that means we are wasting time by playing c6 and then c5 in two moves. But in French, the upside is that you're playing c5 in one go instead of playing c6 and then c5. You're playing it in one move. So Caro-Kann has the advantage of opening this bishop and getting it out, and the French has the advantage of being able to play c5 in one move, leading to slightly more active and sometimes more dangerous positions. So the idea in Caro-Kann, the main idea, is to rescue your bishop. So in a lot of these lines, if our opponent, let's say, plays a move like e5, we can get this bishop out to f5, and that is how we play these positions. So that is the main idea of Caro-Kann, and that is what the opening revolves around. It's about getting this bishop out and then playing this sort of a pyramid structure right here. So that's going to be idea number one. Idea number two is going to be to put the bishop on g4 if you can. So let me actually go back. In the main line Caro-Kann, where white plays d4 and say they play the advanced variation, you actually put the bishop on f5. However, this is the main line, but it's not the ideal case scenario for black. The ideal case scenario is if white plays knight f3 move order instead. Say you go d5, white goes e5. Now in this case, we can put the bishop on f5, or we can put the bishop on g4. Earlier, we didn't have the option of putting the bishop on g4 because the knight was back on g1, so the queen was controlling this square on g4. However, in this case, we have the option to go here, and this is actually better. The reason why bishop on g4 is better is because in a lot of lines, you want to take on f3, get rid of this knight, and get rid of the defender of the d4 pawn. You will see this idea very soon, but for now, remember that you want to put the bishop on g4, and this happens in different move orders as well. So for example, if they go e5 and you go for the Botvinnik-Karls variation, say they go c3, this is another very common inaccuracy. In these types of positions, you don't want to go to f5 either. You want to capture, and again, you don't want to put the bishop on f5, you actually want to put the bishop on g4. This is a slightly better placement. So remember to pin this knight and put the bishop on g4 if you can, if you get the ideal move order. Let me go back. If you get this move order, you put the bishop on g4. Idea number 3 is going to be a very common mistake that white makes in this position. One of the most played moves in these types of positions is this move bishop to d3, or maybe white starts with knight f3 and then bishop d3. However, these two moves are virtually the same. Strategically, bishop d3 is a bad move for the white pieces. Now, in this case, if they play bishop d3, you should be very happy with the black pieces. You should capture, and then you should play e6, and they're going to go knight f3, and then you can strike the center with c5. So this is going to be very, very nice for the black pieces. But why is bishop d3 such a bad move for white? The reason why bishop d3 or knight f3, e6, and then bishop d3, the reason why this is so bad for white is because this piece on f5 usually becomes the problem piece in a lot of positions. And this square itself, not just the bishop, not just the light square bishop, but also the square itself of f5 is also very good for the knight. So in the future, if this bishop were to go to e2, let's say, you would have to do some shenanigans with like knight e7, move the bishop, put the knight on f5. This would be later down the road. However, with this move bishop to d3, you're sort of trading off your problem piece, and you're also getting rid of your opponent's good bishop because his central pawns are on dark squares. The light square bishop is white's theoretically good bishop. So you're getting rid of white's good bishop while also freeing up this f5 square for this maneuver of knight e7, knight f5, which is something that we're going to talk about later as well. But remember that bishop d3 is a common mistake in these types of positions, and the way you punish it is not by going back to g6. This is something I've seen before and it's not correct. You have to capture here, and then you have to strike with c5. You trade the bishop off and you strike in the center. Idea number 4 is going to be to pressure the pawn on d4, and you're going to notice that everything revolves around this pawn on d4 in the Caro-Kann. So for example, say you play c5, Panov variation, and white plays c3. This is another common mistake that white makes at lower levels. What you want to do in these types of positions is put the knight on c6, capture first on d4, and then put the bishop on g4, and in a couple of moves do this maneuver of knight to e7 and then knight to f5, and then put the queen on b6. And now what I want you to notice is how harmonious black's position is. So the pawn that was on c5 earlier was pressuring d4. Let me quickly go back. The pawn on c5 was pressuring d4, and also now the knight on c6 is pressuring d4. This knight on f5 is also pressuring d4. This bishop is indirectly pressuring d4 because you're threatening to remove the defender of d4, and the queen is also pressuring the pawn on d4. So everybody's just pressuring this pawn right here. So that is the main idea of the opening. You want to strike with c5, and then you want to put the pieces on squares where they can pressure this pawn on d4. This is the main idea of this opening, and it is something that you should definitely remember. To expand on the previous point, idea number 5 is going to be to trade this bishop for the knight. So for example, in this position, if your opponent plays h3, what you want to do is you want to take this knight on f3. So a lot of people in this position would go back, and let's say white plays g4. g4 is actually not a fork. It looks like a fork, but actually you can take the bishop on e3 with a tempo on the queen, and then you can save this bishop. However, you don't want to go back here with the black pieces. What you want to do instead is that you want to get rid of the defender, and this is a very common trade in the advanced Caro-Kann. Notice that I'm saying the advanced Caro-Kann. It is a bit more situational in other variations. So for example, if you have a bishop on g4 in the exchange variation, then taking on f3 is sometimes good and sometimes not so good. That's more situational, and that's something you have to calculate. However, in the advanced variation, you take most of the time. The only exception to this is if they have the knight on d2 rather than on c3. So say in this position, instead of knight c3, they play this move knight to d2, and then we get the same sequence of moves. In this case, you don't want to take on f3 anymore, because now if you take on f3, that doesn't give you anything because white just captures back. So white replaced his knight on f3 with his other knight, and you haven't really achieved anything. So this is one of those situations, one of those rare exceptions where you actually drop the bishop back to h5 in the advanced Caro-Kann, advanced variation of the Caro-Kann. I have to specify that because people get this mixed up a lot. I've seen my students, for example, in the exchange Caro-Kann, they always take on f3 when that's not the case. You almost always want to take on f3 in the advanced Caro-Kann, and this is one exception because the knight replaces the other knight. So in this case, you would go back, white would play g4, you would take on e3, and then you would get this sequence, but instead of knight being on c3, here the knight is on d2, and then you can do many different things. The game goes on from here. You have the bishop pair with black and a slightly more comfortable position. Another very important idea that you have to know is the alternative route to f5 that this knight can take. So earlier we talked about how this knight can go to e7 and f5 after e6 is played, of course. However, another route is knight h6 to knight f5. And now a lot of people in these types of structures, they play f4 a little too early. So for example, f4 in this specific position is positionally incorrect, and it looks very natural because you're supporting the center and you want to potentially start a kingside attack down the road based on this pawn structure. However, this f4 pawn push blocks this bishop, so knight can freely go to h6 without having to worry about this bishop because the pawn is blocking it. So what that would look like is something like this. We both play some very, very natural moves. So all of the pieces, knight on c6, pressure on d4, queen on b6, important square for the queen, queen b6. This happens in Caro-Kann a lot as well. You want to put this knight on h6 now. You don't necessarily have to go to e7. So if you go to e7 here, the downside of going to e7 is that it always blocks the bishop, and now there's d takes c5, which is very bad for the black pieces. However, if you go knight h6, this bishop remains open. So the downside of knight h6 typically is that the bishop can take. Downside of knight e7 is that it blocks the bishop. However, in this case, there is no downside to going to h6 because this bishop right here on e3 cannot take on h6 because of this pawn. So f4 is not a huge issue. I know a lot of people get nervous when their opponents play moves like f4 because it reinforces the control of the e5 pawn. However, you have this alternative route, and in the future you're going to move this bishop to either g4 or e4. Let's say bishop to e2 is played. Here you can go bishop to e4, castles. You can take on f3. You can basically chop everything down and then put the knight on f5. So that's what you do. You go with this route instead of this route, so you don't have to block your bishop like this. This blocks your bishop, and this would be very bad. Another very important idea that you have to know is that weirdly, knight h6 is not a bad move. Even if this white bishop takes on h6 and doubles your pawns, that's not really that bad. So for example, if you jump to h6, this is the top computer move, by the way. Knight h6 is the best move. After bishop takes h6, g takes h6, it's really not that bad. Yes, the structure is a little bit ugly, but you have an open g file to work with, and you also have the bishop pair. So you get two additional benefits and you get one minus. So is it really all that bad? I would say it's actually good for black, and I would say that this position is quite comfortable for the black pieces, and the play could continue something like this. And this is a very nice position for the black pieces because of the bishop pair, the semi-open g-file. These are all resources that you can utilize in a game. However, you have to know one key detail before you play knight to h6. So if you notice, let me actually go back. This was the opening. I want to show you the whole opening from the very beginning. So it's the Caro-Kann, of course, Botvinnik-Karl's variation. But here I specifically chose this line with bishop e3 and then bishop to e2. And then I went knight h6. However, say your opponent plays knight to c3 instead. This is a different story because after knight c3, bishop e2, now knight h6 is not as good because white gets to play this bishop takes h6 move in one go. Instead of that, earlier, if you noticed, after bishop to e3, e6, and then bishop e2, knight h6, this bishop has already moved once. So white, in addition to trading bishop for a knight, is also losing time by making this exchange. So white loses time here. But if they go knight to c3 instead in this position, now knight h6 all of a sudden is not such a good move, because if you take back, this is just a little bit uncomfortable at this point because you don't really have anything. There's always knight a4 here. So white has a little bit of extra development, and this actually leads to more active positions for the white pieces. So it just goes to show that everything in chess is about time and how fast you develop. In this case, knight h6 is bad because white plays bishop takes in one go. However, if they develop to e3 already and then you go knight h6, now taking on h6 and the doubling of the pawns here all of a sudden is not so bad because of the benefits that you get. The semi-open g-file, let me actually show that, semi-open g-file, the bishop pair, and additionally the time that white lost by playing this move, bishop e3 and bishop h6. So everything in chess is about pluses and minuses, and that's something that you sort of have to realize, and that's something that you have to work with in your games. Idea number 8 is going to be moving the bishop again in order to free up the square on f5. So we have already come to the conclusion that this knight wants to end up on f5. However, in a lot of the advanced Caro-Kann lines, the bishop is already on f5. However, what you have to know is that in a lot of lines, you still have to make sure to maneuver this knight to f5. So you have to move this bishop again to either to g4 or to e4 in some cases, or either to g6. So these are all theoretical ideas. Sometimes h6 and bishop to h7 is played, and that's how this knight ends up on this square on f5. So these are all different lines and different ideas that you can go for. It's just a matter of which one do you prefer, which one are you the most comfortable with. So remember, sometimes you have to move this bishop again in order to free up this square on f5. Idea number 9 is going to be your bishop getting trapped, and this is a very famous trap in the Tal variation of the Caro-Kann. After h4, a lot of people here play this move e6, which is obviously a blunder because of this move g4, and bishop e4 there's f3, and you can retreat the bishop back to g6, but you get trapped with this move h5, so you lose the bishop. So no matter where you go after g4, you're going to get attacked by these pawns right here, and this bishop is trapped. So you want to avoid this by either playing this move h6 or playing h5. These are both valid variations in the Caro-Kann, but make sure that you don't get your bishop trapped. Idea number 10 is going to be queen a5, queen a6 maneuver, and this might look weird. Why would we want to play queen a5, queen a6? Well, in this case, after h4, first and foremost, we already talked about that you cannot play e6 because your bishop gets trapped with g4. So let's say we go h5, which is one of the variations, and after bishop to d3, we exchange, we go e6, and then we play this queen a5 check, and then we go queen a6. Once this queen ends up on d3, with this maneuver, we are offering a queen trade, and white has to accept, because if white does not accept the queen trade, then the king will never castle, because the queen on a6 cuts this diagonal off. Of course, the king cannot castle through a check. And if white accepts this queen trade, then after knight to a6, this is just completely equal. Black has zero problems in the position. If anything, I would prefer black's position due to the pawn structure and pawns being placed on dark squares, which would favor the black pieces since black has the dark square bishop. So in this case, it would make sense that this is not a great option for the white pieces. Now, after you give this check on a5, there are a couple of ways that white can block. White can block with bishop to d2, which we just saw. White can block with c3 or knight c3. All of these moves are wrong, and queen a6 is a very strong reply to all of these options. The only good option here for white, and this is the main move, is knight to d2. This is the most played move. However, even a lot of higher rated players don't know this, and they make lots of mistakes here. They block with the pawn or they block with the bishop. So basically, it's a common mistake. You have to know to block with the knight on d2 specifically. So if black plays a move like queen a6, there is c4, and if bishop to b4, pinning the knight, there is b3. And after b3, if we ever capture on c4, white captures with the pawn, maintaining the control over the central squares. So this is the way. Of course, you would not take here, you would do some other things, and the game continues on from here. But a very common mistake, as I said, is blocking with the bishop, blocking with the pawn, or blocking with the knight on c3. All three of these options are wrong, and all of them are easily punished by queen a6. Idea number 11 is going to be e6 pawn sacrifice. So in a lot of these tall positions, after h4, we can either play h5 or h6. If we play h6, we are still allowing this move g4. And after a couple of moves, what tends to happen is that white has this option of playing e6. And this is going to be a very common resource that white is going to have in lots of different positions. And it is very dangerous because if you simply capture it, now this diagonal is open, the square on e5 is going to be a little bit weak, and after a move like bishop d3, let's say takes, this queen is coming to g6, and you have to be very, very careful. It's not lost yet, but this is already extremely uncomfortable, and this is a very, very common pawn sacrifice that white has in these types of positions. You might have noticed here that I went bishop e4 first before going back to h7, and this is very important because if you simply go back to h7 after this pawn sacrifice e6, and let's say you play f takes e6 and white plays bishop to d3, the problem here for the black pieces, there's an extra issue that you have with black, and that is that this knight is coming to f3 and it's coming to e5. So for example, if you play king to d7 here to try to run, knight f3, and this knight is simply coming to e5, and it is kind of difficult to kick it out of here, and white's position is very, very bad. If you go king to c7, knight e5 anyways, let's say knight d7, there's knight f7 here with a fork, so this is extremely dangerous. There are not a lot of things you can do in this position because of these squares being extremely weak. So it is very important in this position to go to e4 first, which wins a tempo since it hits the rook. But if you don't want to allow black to get this tempo, you have to play f3. And this f3 move blocks the knight from going to f3. So this is a very key detail that you have to know. And of course, if knight to f3 is played, you can just continue with e6 and you can exchange on f3 at any moment. Or if, let's say, white goes over here, you can even exchange on d3, and you don't really get this, well, white doesn't get this e6 pawn sacrifice once you yourself play e6. So make sure to play bishop e4 in order to bait out f3. One of the most important squares in Caro-Kann is this square on f5, and you want to fight for this square. Both sides want to fight for this f5 square actually. So let's say we take a look at this knight c3 variation after g4, bishop g6, h4. In this position, which move is better, h5 or h6, and why? And let me tell you, h5 is much better than h6 here, because if you go h6 after a move like h5, you go back to h7, and now there's f4, and the thing is, well, game continues on from here. It's not immediately winning for the white pieces, but eventually what will happen is that white will trade off the light square bishops, and white will prepare this move f5. So white will have the control over the f5 square. However, if we go h5 instead, now we are challenging this pawn, and a mistake that is actually a very common mistake is this move g5. And now this is very, very bad for white positionally, because white will never get to play this move f5. Well, he can play f4, but he's never going to be able to play f5 because let's say bishop to d3 or knight e7, bishop d3 is played or something like this. We can easily exchange on d3 and then we can go g6, and now this pawn break is simply not possible on f5 even if white plays f4, and we have an outpost on f5. So make sure to fight for this f5 square with moves like h5, and this is very good because it baits out g5 or it baits out capturing, and once again this is strategically very, very good for the black pieces since you have control over the f5 square. In a lot of Caro-Kann positions, control over f5 and g4 is very important, as we established, and a very common move in order to try to establish control over the squares over here is to play h5. Well, in this case, we're not necessarily playing h5 to chip away at the pawns, but h5 as an idea to control g4 is very, very important, because if white does not manage to play g4, white will never manage to play f5. So this is another key idea that you have to remember. Play h5 in order to secure g4, and once you secure g4, that means f5 for white is never going to be possible. But what happens if you're not in time and if you are not able to play h5 in time in these types of positions? Is g4 really all that dangerous? Sometimes it can be. However, if white plays g4, what you can do is actually just go to h4. If g4, you can simply go knight h4 and offer the exchange of the knights, and this is totally fine for the black pieces. Even if white manages to play g4, you're not in any trouble just yet. You still have to be careful because white will play f4, f5 later down the road, but right now you're not in any trouble. You can go to h4 as long as you have either a bishop on e7 or a queen on d8 supporting it. Now, of course, in this case we have both, but you need at least one of them to actually go to h4 and make this knight trade, and you're totally fine. Idea number 16 is going to be attacking with g5 instead of just simply kingside castling. So in this position, yes, you can castle kingside and you would be totally fine with the black pieces. However, you have a way more interesting approach and a way more fun approach, and I think even objectively better. I would go even as far as to say that you can play this move g5. Now g5 has two ideas in mind. One of the ideas, and the main idea, is the attacking idea, the fact that you want to attack this king and you just want to throw your pawns out and then of course trying to open up this king. The second idea is positional. You want to get this pawn to g4 in order to remove the knight from the defense of this d4 pawn. So for example, if white were to play a move like rook to c1, this is very bad because of g4, knight goes back, and all of a sudden this pawn on d4 is hanging and you can just simply take it. It's just a free pawn. So there's this positional idea behind g5, g4, but also there's an attacking idea behind it. Say white plays h3. In this case, after h3, of course we can't play g4 right away. However, we can actually queenside castle here, which looks crazy, but there's no attack. We can simply tuck the king away at b8, and now that white played h3, this pawn on h3 can be used as a hook. So rook to g8 with g4 is coming in order to open up the g file and attack this king right here. So this move g5 is another fantastic approach to the position. Now we are going to move on to a different variation. We're going to move to ideas in the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, and the first idea is going to be restricting the light square bishop. So what white wants to do in these types of positions is play a move like bishop to d3. So bishop d3 controls f5, and say black plays knight to f6. What white can play is this move h3, and what we are trying to do here with the white pieces is that we're trying to control f5, we're trying to control g4, which means that this bishop will stay sort of locked out here, and it is very uncomfortable. You can even start with a move like c3 here, and this is actually not a good move, but it is a very common move here, which is e6. blocking this bishop out completely, the best thing to do is to just simply play e5 after c3 and just blast open the position. But after c3, oftentimes black plays e6, which means that this bishop will be locked out. And this is just a little bit uncomfortable. So if you want to move order your opponent into an uncomfortable position, go bishop d3 and go h3, and don't allow this bishop to get out. We just talked about how white's idea is to restrict this bishop on c8, but an extremely common mistake, this is so common, it happens all the time, is this move knight to f3. And knight to f3 is absolutely insane in this position, because after knight to f3, what will black play here? Very simple, bishop to g4. Now, we just talked about how restricting this bishop is one of the main ideas in the exchange Caro-Kann. But if you play knight f3, you're basically giving up this g4 square with the white pieces on like a silver platter. That's crazy. You do not want to be playing moves like knight to f3 with white in this position, allowing bishop g4. You have multiple different ideas here, and you have multiple ways you can play. For example, well, this pawn is hanging, so you have to defend it either with c3 or you have to defend it with knight e2. At least when white plays knight e2, after bishop to g4, there's f3, and there are some ideas of castles, and then queen e1, queen h4. This is like some high-level maneuver. You don't have to worry about this if you're lower rated. But the thing is that knight f3 just gives up this square for no reason, and it immediately equalizes the position, which is of course favorable for the black pieces. Don't put the knight on f3 if you're playing white, and pin the knight on f3 if you're playing with black. Idea number 19 is going to be aware of the poisoned pawn. So in the exchange variation, in the main line of the exchange variation, which is this, oftentimes what happens is that this queen goes out to b3, and yeah, you can defend it with the black pieces, but after a couple of moves, after bishop d6 specifically, and this exchange happens, the pawn on b7 is hanging. So after white captures the pawn on b7 though, this is simply not a good capture for white. And if you're playing with the black pieces, you should study this idea, and you should learn how to get compensation whenever white takes this pawn, and that will allow you to win a lot of games, because the position here is very tricky, and after rook to b8, it's actually slightly favorable for the black pieces. And well, it was in the minuses, it's equal, but it's a little bit in the minuses, so that means that black has enough compensation for the pawn, and if you learn how to play these positions, then you're going to be able to win a lot of games. There are many ways you can go wrong here. For example, rook b6 and then e5, and this queen is totally out of the game while we're threatening this move right here. And if white takes this pawn on e5, we can take back, and now we're completely opening up this position. White did not have the chance to castle, because if white castled, well, then the pawn would have been hanging on b2 earlier. Like, let's say over here, the pawn was hanging, we were threatening to win back the pawn, but the best thing for white was actually to castle. But if white doesn't do that, white gets greedy, tries to hang on to the pawn. Well, this is what happens. Now the position opens up, and this is completely winning for the black pieces. Idea number 20 is going to be doubled f pawns are good for black, and you will see what I mean in just a moment. So in a lot of these lines, we already talked about that black wants to get this bishop out and white wants to restrict the bishop. And one of the ways you can play, which I think is one of the most interesting ways to play, is to play g6 and then play bishop to f5. Now, if white just simply castles here, you will exchange on d3 and you're playing a totally normal game. However, if white decides to take on f5, now we go into this variation right here, and this is very interesting because in this variation, black has these doubled pawns, but you have the semi-open g file, you have this very nice square for your knight on e4, and this is actually quite tricky. Let's say white castles here, you can go e6, then you're gonna put the bishop on d6, put the knight on e4, put the rook on g8, and you can go for some sort of a kingside attack. These positions are very, very dangerous for white, and in some positions you can even castle queenside and you're totally safe with black, while white's king is not safe at all. So these doubled f pawns, they're actually not very bad. They are an asset instead of a liability. Idea number 21 is going to be to study the plans of the Carlsbad structure, because the exchange Caro-Kann is the Carlsbad structure. So what are your options here with the black pieces? So for example, let's say h3 is played here and both sides are just simply developing, nothing crazy going on just yet. Black castles, and let's say white plays this move knight to h4. Actually, let me go back to this position right here, because even from here there are multiple different options that white has, and there are multiple different options that black has, and I'm just going to talk about the plans. I don't really want to get into any specifics. You have two main plans with the black pieces, and those plans are the minority attack with rook to b8, b5, a5 and b4, or b5, b4 if white allows it, or you have a second plan which is f6 and then e5, and it's better to play rook e8, f6, e5 and play in the center of the board. So you have these two main plans in this position with the black pieces. And let's say white plays h4 and knight h4 and then bishop e2, queen e2. Now you have to realize that sometimes you're not going to get your desired plan. For example, because that this move was played specifically and the bishops have been exchanged, there's a lot of pressure on e6, so you cannot go f6, e5 anymore. In a position like this, it's better to go rook b8 and go for the minority attack with b5, a5, b4. So you have to look at what white plays and which plan he stops. So for example, in this case, he stopped the f6 e5 plan, so you go for the minority attack. If he tries to stop the minority attack with a move like a4, you can try to set it up with moves like a6 and b5, for example, anyways, or you can try to put the rook on e8 and then try to go for f6 e5 plan. So you have these options with the black pieces. Idea number 22 is going to be don't get Greek gifted, because there are some Greek gifting ideas in these types of positions, especially when the knight goes to e7. Actually, when the knight goes to e7. If this knight goes to f6, there are not any Greek gift ideas, because this pawn on h7 is going to be defended. But in a lot of cases, in these types of Carlsbad structures, the knight actually goes to e7 because black actually wants to maintain the option of playing f6, e5, what we just talked about. So this knight in a lot of lines goes to e7, and if you're not careful and if you castle in positions like these, there's bishop takes h7, knight g5, and if you go back, of course, there's queen takes h5 with a devastating attack. If you go forward, there is still g4. So don't get Greek gifted, be very, very careful. Another option and another way of playing that black has here is to strike in the center with e5, and this is mainly played when moves like h3 are played, and if knight f3 is played, of course you don't go for e5 here, you go for bishop to g4. But if h3 is played in these types of positions, what you can do is actually you can strike in the center with e5, and after this exchange, yes, you have an isolated pawn, but the thing is that you're actually going to get very active positions. And even though this looks very dangerous for the black pieces, oh my god, I have an isolated pawn, but you have to realize isolated pawn does not mean that you're lost. And actually, in this position, computer prefers black. It's minus 0.3. So it means that it's close to equality, but black is slightly preferred because of the activity of the pieces. So you have to be very aware of this, and instead of being afraid of a move like e5 and then going into an isolated pawn structure, try to learn it and try to learn the ideas here, because this is another great way of playing this position that will give you lots of active positions. Idea number 24 is going to be to play queen a5 check in order to force the knight in front of the pawn. So in a lot of these positions, this bishop actually goes to b5. It's actually not a good move to put the bishop on b5. It is more preferable to put it on d3. However, a lot of people play this move, and the thing about this move is that you have queen a5 check. This is a fork, and the only move to not lose here is to block with the knight on c3 and then protect this bishop. The thing about this position, though, is that the knight does not belong on c3 in these types of positions because it blocks the c pawn. This pawn wants to be on c3 and this knight wants to go to d2 later on, but with this move, queen a5, we are forcing knight c3, and you're not winning right away. I'm not going to say that you're winning right away, and don't mistake this position for a winning position. It is equal. However, this is just a slight inconvenience for the white pieces because white wants to play his setup ideally, but he's not going to get that anymore because you played this queen a5 check. And from here you can continue with a move like bishop to g4, and if white castles you can continue with e6 and you get a very solid position and you get a lot of play here, and you're getting an improved version of the Carlsbad structure because the knight will have to move. White will have to eventually play c3 anyways, otherwise you're going to mount up a lot of pressure here. So knight e2 and c3 will be played anyways, and that just loses a lot of time. So this is a good thing to remember. Queen a5 check to force out knight c3 is very useful, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're winning right away. You just get a more comfortable position and you're going to win time in the middle game. So remember to go queen a5 check whenever there's a bishop on b5 and bait out knight c3. Now let's briefly talk about the hillbilly variation, which is this move bishop to c4. Now bishop to c4 is supposed to be a tricky move, but it's actually not, because the way I'm going to teach you to beat hillbilly is that hillbilly is just an improved exchange variation, but for black, because once you go d5, e5, cd5 is going to happen, bishop b5, and you're going to get a couple of moves like this. You're still in the exchange variation. This is not a totally separate opening variation that is super tricky. No, this is still the exchange variation of the Caro-Kann, and this bishop can go back to b3, for example, and it's still going to be an exchange variation of the Caro-Kann. And if your opponent doesn't take, if he goes to b3, then he loses the pawn, and if he goes to d3, well, you get the whole center. So this is very, very useful for the black pieces, but don't treat hillbilly as some sort of a different system, because it's really not. It's just an exchange variation, which is worse for white. So keep that in mind and actually study the exchange variation so you're easily able to punish hillbilly. Now we're going to move on to the Panov variation of the Caro-Kann, which is after it takes on d5 and c takes d5. Here white plays this move c4. And now when white plays this move c4, let's say we play knight f6, knight c3, very natural moves. There are three main setups that black has in this position. Those setups are e6, which is a very normal move, a g6 setup, and bishop to e6, which kind of transposes into the g6 setup. And all of these are a little bit different. All of them have pluses and minuses. So for example, with e6, you get the bishop out this way. This bishop stays locked in. This knight, of course, goes to c6. And this bishop is often developed to b7 on this diagonal, and it opens up once we capture the pawn on c4. So this is just a very normal positional setup, and we play against the isolated queen's pawn down the road. Now we have this g6 setup also, where we put the bishop on g7, and the advantage of this setup is that this bishop will be pressuring the pawn on d4 from g7. However, it is a little bit more dangerous now because this pawn is under attack, and white can put a lot of pressure on this diagonal. You will see what I'm talking about very, very soon. So there's g6, there's e6, but there's also this weird move, bishop to e6. With bishop e6, the thing is you're attacking this pawn on c4, and it looks like a weird setup. What you're trying to do is that you're trying to bait out c5, and because now there is no more pressure on d5, now you want to go g6. So this is also kind of like the g6 setup, but it's just a little bit different with a different move order because you're trying to bait out c5. So these are the three options that you have in this position. Idea number 27 is going to be to take on c4 only after the white bishop develops, the light square bishop develops to either e2 or d3. So in this case, if we take on c4, white simply captures back, and this is just a very good exchange for white because white gets this very nice bishop on this diagonal. But instead, what we want to do is wait a little bit. We can do a couple of different things. We can play bishop to g4, for example, and say white plays this move bishop to e2. In these types of positions, taking on c4 is slightly better. Now, why is that? That's because this bishop has already moved, and if it captures the pawn back, now we just simply go with e6, and we have gained an extra developing move with bishop to g4. Because in the earlier case, when we took right away, this bishop ended up on c4 right away. So this way, by waiting here and then taking on c4, we just gain a single tempo, which is always very useful. Idea number 28 is going to be this queen b3 move, which is extremely dangerous in the Panov lines, especially when either bishop g4 is played or when g6 is played. So if you play e6 in these types of positions, queen b3 is not as strong because this pawn is sufficiently reinforced. But if bishop to g4 is played or g6, a move that doesn't necessarily address this pawn, then queen b3 all of a sudden becomes a very strong idea. Captures first and then queen to b3. And this is really, really dangerous, and you have to be very careful with black. So for example, you have to take this knight on f3, and after g takes f3, e6 has to be played, but now this pawn is hanging, and of course you cannot defend the pawn because the knight is also hanging, so you have to defend the knight. But if the knight captures on c3, this looks good for the black pieces because black is thinking, I'm going to take on c3 and then I'm going to defend this pawn somehow, let's say with a move like queen c7, for example. But the problem is the diagonal here is very, very weak. You have this move d5, the knight has to move, let's say knight e5, natural move, you go bishop to b5 check. And now you're in a lot of trouble because this knight has to go back and you can't really develop with the black pieces. So castles, for example, you cannot play e6, you will get absolutely blasted if you play e6. If you try a6, there's bishop to f4, which is a crazy sacrifice. Queen takes f4, bishop d7, and then queen b7 picks up this rook. Let's say queen c7, we take this rook over here, and this is just very, very nice position for the white pieces. So it's extremely dangerous. You cannot play a6 either. You have to try something like queenside castling, but it's still a very dangerous position because after bishop to e3, rook to b1, white is ahead in development, and this position is very, very dangerous. And generally, it's not just in this variation, but in a lot of variations, this queen b3 idea is extremely devastating, especially after the bishop moves, because now this pawn is undefended. So you usually get a double attack here on the pawn on b7 and on the pawn on d5. Earlier, we talked about this move, bishop to e6, which looks a little bit weird, but it actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Because when we play bishop to e6, one of the main ideas here is to actually put the bishop on d5. So let's say our opponent captures, you don't want to take with the knight. You actually want to take with the bishop. The reason why you don't want to take with the knight is because it's very uncomfortable to have this bishop on e6. Now, if white were to take, this would be fantastic for black, but if white knows what he's doing, he's not going to take this knight. But if you take with the bishop here, you get an extra developing move. You centralize this bishop, and even though you're going to lose the bishop pair here, if white decides to take, you can always just recapture with the queen, and your activity and the pressure on this pawn on d4 makes up for the fact that you just lost the bishop pair. So one of the ideas of bishop to e6 is to actually put the bishop on d5 and keep it on a very active square, and you're not afraid of your opponent taking it because you're just going to take with the queen. So this is a very interesting idea. Let's talk about this bishop to e6 variation one more time. The main idea of this line is to bait out c5. And this is a key idea because once you bait out c5, there's no more pressure on this pawn on d5, and now you're free to do whatever you want. Now there's some key theoretical details and some key ideas that you have to know in this opening after you bait out c5. For example, you want to go g6 and you want to put the bishop on g7. You don't want to play knight c6 early, because if you play knight c6 early in this position, white will not play bishop e2 or bishop d3. White will actually go to b5 straight up, and that's actually something you want to avoid. You want to avoid bishop b5 pinning your knight, and in this case, if bishop b5 check is played, you want to block with the bishop, and this way you're offering an exchange of the bishops. Of course, white doesn't have to follow through with an exchange, he can go back, but if he follows through, okay, well, you take, you put the knight on c6, and you're totally fine in these types of positions. So this is a very interesting theoretical idea as well. You want to delay knight c6 a little bit, but let's say bishop e2 is played and you castle. White should play h3, because let's say white castles here. This is another very important idea. You want to go bishop g4, so you actually want to trade the bishop for the knight in some positions and then put this knight on e4 to pressure this pawn right here. But you can also continue with different moves. For example, after h3, you can put this knight on e4, put this knight on c6, and this is how you continue playing. And these positions are super tricky. They're super fun to play. I suggest studying them, because this is, in my opinion, the best way to fight back against the Panov, the most straightforward way, because a lot of Panov lines unfortunately lead to those types of positions where a lot of things trade very quickly and the position gets liquidated too quickly because there are some theoretical ideas. But the thing is, with bishop e6, it's actually a very practical move, and if you know your move orders here, then you are going to trick your opponents into a suboptimal move order for them and get a very nice position. So the main goal of bishop e6 is to bait out this pawn and then pressure the pawn on d4 in the long run. Idea number 31 is going to be careful when putting the bishop on g4 in the accelerated Panov. So what I'm talking about is actually quite simple. This is the accelerated Panov with early c4. In a lot of these lines, after this exchange, this bishop goes out to c4. You know, black takes back the pawn that he sacrificed for a moment here, not taking with the queen because you would get hit with a tempo. So black chooses to go with knight to f6 and take back with the knight. And in these types of positions, what tends to happen is that after the knight moves away, a lot of people develop the bishop to g4, and the problem with this move is that there's bishop takes f7 check, and this is just a very simple tactic. King takes f7, knight g5, the king has to move, and then queen takes g4. So a very simple thing that you have to avoid. Instead of putting the bishop on g4, put it on f5. In the accelerated Panov, when there's so much pressure on f7, put the bishop on f5 and don't fall for this bishop f7 trick. Now let us move on to the main lines of Caro-Kann with the knight to c3 or knight d2. This can be reached with both move orders because we take here on e4, and the thing is, this is literally called the main line. If you go back to this position, technically the main line is e5. e5 is the most played move, but this after captures is called the main line. But yeah, it is one of the main lines in the position, and the idea 32 is going to be about the Caro-Kann variation. So after knight f6, captures. The thing about this position is that you get a lot of activity with the black pieces. You have open diagonals, you have open lines, but the thing is, this structure right here is bad in the long run. The reason why this structure is bad in the long run is because if white trades all the pieces off the board with these doubled pawns 4 on 3, you're not going to be able to create a passed pawn with this 4 on 3. If you guys have watched my doubled pawns video, I actually talk about this in my doubled pawns video, which is the fact that some structures, even though you have an extra pawn, with the structure that we have right now, you can't really break through with this majority, but white can create a passed pawn with c4 d5. So let me actually go forward here, and I'm going to skip a lot of things, and I'm going to skip a lot of moves. I'm going to make a bunch of different trades here and go to this position right here. Now, in this type of a position, white is better. And if white is able to trade the bishop for a knight without transforming the structure, it is going to be winning for the white pieces. Why? Because you simply cannot create a passed pawn here with black. And let me actually show you what I mean by that. I'm going to make a couple of moves. These are not going to be good moves, by the way, but I'm just going to make a couple of moves just like this. So we have made a couple of moves and then we're in this position. So in this position, it is completely winning for the white pieces, even though it's equal material, because as I said, you cannot create a passed pawn here. What white will do here, I'm just going to make a lot of weird moves, but what white will do here is white will go f4 and then white will go h4, or do something like this, make a bowl of pawns. And the thing is, if you go f6 and if you try to go g5, if you push the pawn to g4, the position is locked. If you decide to take, the position is kind of locked anyways. You cannot exactly create a passed pawn because of these doubled pawns, while white can easily create a passed pawn with a move like c4 or even b3 and then c4. These are both possibilities here. Actually, b3 c4 is better according to the computer, but it should still be winning. I don't know why it didn't like c4 immediately for a moment. And white finally gets his passed pawn while black cannot create a passed pawn. Another very important concept, and this might be the most important concept in this video, and that is that if you get this structure right here, if you get the pawn cube, you have to realize this is legitimately one of the best structures in chess. No joke, this structure right here is incredible. And a lot of people think that doubled pawns are really, really bad all the time. And they look at this position and they see two sets of doubled pawns and they just faint. They just lose their mind. How can this be good in any way, shape, or form? But the thing is that you have so many pawns in front of your king that your king is completely safe. And as a matter of fact, you can just throw these pawns forward with barely any repercussions. And I will show you an example of that. Let's say white just continues playing normally. Both sides continue playing normally, just developing their pieces. We strike with f5. All of a sudden, we are trying to attack the white king with one of our doubled pawns. And after takes, this knight can go to e4. We can do a bunch of different maneuvers. We can bring this rook up to e6 to move it to g6. And this was all possible because we had the pawn cube and we were able to use the pawn cube and just throw the pawns forward. And this is very, very nice. So remember that pawn cube is a legendary pawn structure in chess. Let me go back so you can see it properly. This is a legendary structure in chess. I don't want to hear any disrespect about this structure. Another very important concept that you have to remember is that in Tartakower, even though your pawn structure is not good in the long run, you have a lot of attacking possibilities due to open diagonals and open lines. And actually, as a matter of fact, if white plays a move like rook to d1, let's say, this already allows bishop takes h3. And after g takes h3, queen h3, this is an excellent position for the black pieces. This knight is going to go to g6, and then it can go somewhere over here in the future, most likely to h4. This bishop is in the attack. In some lines, rarely you're able to bring this rook over here. In this case, that's not exactly possible because the rooks are seeing each other, but you have lots of possibilities. And actually, there's only one move in this position that doesn't lose right away, and that is this move bishop to e4. And in this case, black is still better because of like knight g6, and you can bring the knight and you can try to attack here. But white is barely hanging on if he finds like bishop e4 and rook e3, and white is barely not losing here. And actually, it might still be lost if you know these types of positions. So what I'm trying to say is that remember that in Tartakower, you often have very, very strong kingside initiative. Now let's move on to a different variation of the Caro-Kann. Let's talk about the classical line with bishop to f5. So in this one, there is a very key detail that you have to know in these types of positions, and that is to meet knight to f3, not with e6, but with knight to d7. Now, e6 is still good. I'm not going to say that e6 is like a bad move or anything like that, but you have to be really careful because after h4, you have to go h6 because you don't want to get your bishop trapped, or then you don't want to make this trade. After h6, there is this move knight to e5, hitting the bishop. Bishop moves over to h7, and you get attacked a lot with queen to h5, and this is extremely dangerous. You have to be very precise with queen f7, then there's queen f3 here, and you have to go knight f6, and these lead to these sort of slightly uncomfortable positions that you can all avoid. You can avoid all of these move orders if you just simply start with knight to d7, because when you start with knight d7, h4, h6, if white goes h5, okay, you just move the bishop, and then they go bishop d3, you exchange, and then you play e6, and this is totally fine for the black pieces. So remember to play knight d7 over e6. Idea number 36 is going to be this maneuver of queen to d5 and queen e4 in order to offer a queen trade. Now in this position you play knight f6, a very natural move, and in a lot of positions white plays this move knight to e4. Now white instead of knight e4 can also castle, and in which case you have to be a little bit careful. In this case you have to put the bishop on e7 rather than on d6. Bishop d6 looks very natural, but actually it is a slight inaccuracy because of what I'm about to show you. So you actually put the bishop on e7, and in a lot of these positions white plays this idea of knight to e4, and the goal is to move the knight away and start an attack on the king side with moves like g4, g5. And in this case, what you want to do is you want to capture this knight on e4, and then you want to put the other knight on f6. So you replace the knight on f6 with the other knight, and then queen will go to e2, and now and only now you have this maneuver. Oh, not queen d4, but you have queen d5, queen e4. So let's say queen d5 is played in this position, c4 can be played by white, some other moves can, probably king b1 can also be played, but after something is played, you go queen to e4, and after queen e4, you are offering a queen trade, and basically you're nullifying this attack, because once the queens are off the board, the king side attack is much less potent for the white pieces. So keep this idea of queen d5, queen e4 in mind. This is a very nice queen trade for black. Idea number 37 is going to be to play b5 in order to win this square on d5. So let's say our opponent here plays pawn to c4. Now against pawn to c4, yes, we can castle, but we don't even have to castle right away. We can play this move b5. And now the idea of b5 is that if white simply captures here on b5, we will simply recapture back. We are opening up some lines for our pieces towards the white king. So we're going to start an attack on this king. However, if instead of capturing, white decides to play c5, trying to keep the position closed, well, in this case, there's first of all a tactical problem because there's knight takes c5, but also this square on d5 has been weakened. So you don't go knight d5 right now. Just to make that very clear, I would not recommend playing knight d5 right now. I would recommend taking the free pawn. However, this square on d5 is always going to be available for you from now on because you played this move b5. And in a lot of positions, b5 is a very useful move in order to control c4, and if you're able to control c4, that means your knight can be freely centralized on d5. So it's sort of a multi-purpose move. You're trying to control the d5 square while also opening up some lines towards your opponent's king. And finally, idea number 38 is going to be the best way to deal with the pawn storm on g4 is to actually just accept the pawn. So in this case, say knight f6 is played, you will simply capture back. And in a lot of these positions, what tends to happen is that you will strike in the center and white will try to attack with g4 and then g5. And usually the best thing to do in these types of positions is to actually take the pawn on g4, because once you take the pawn on g4, you can then try to reinforce this knight with f5. First of all, you're threatening a fork here of like everybody, the rooks and the queen, so queen e2 will be played. But in a lot of these positions, you can actually go f5 once you protect this pawn. So the best move in this position is to either go c takes d4 or to play this move queen to b6. Let's say c takes d4 is played, rook h to g1, and in this case you go d3 and then you go f5. So you just give this pawn back in order to create this target, and then you reinforce the knight with f5. Even though you're giving up this pawn with a check, yes, that is true, you're giving it up with a check. However, it is something that needs to be done, because if you just simply go back, you're going to get absolutely blasted. So the best way to deal with the kingside attack over here is to accept the sacrificed pawn and then reinforce it with f5 later down the road.